For our final speaker of the night, I'm going to introduce an old coworker of mine, how time flies, Marion Huggins, who's going to introduce our final author of the evening, Dawnie Walton.
Thank you so much, Kim. I enjoyed working with you and I enjoy seeing you in these events. This is fantastic. And Dawnie Walton, your book was awesome, okay? It was one of the best books I ever read, and I read a lot of books. So I'm just gonna read your bio and then I'm gonna let you take over, okay?
Okay.
Dawnie Walton is the author of the final revival of Opal and Nev, winner of the 2022 Aspen Words Literary Prize, the VCU Cable First Novelist Award, and the Audie Award for Fiction. Her debut novel is also a finalist for the Mark Twain American Voice in Literature Award and was longlisted for the 2022 Women's Prize for Fiction. It was also named one of the best books of 2021 by the Washington Post, NPR, Esquire, and former US President Barack Obama. She's the co-founder and editorial director of URSA, an audio production company celebrating short fiction from underrepresented voices, and is the co-host of its accompanying podcast. Formerly an editor at Essence and Entertainment Weekly, she has received fellowships from McDowell and Tin House and an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. She was born and raised in Jacksonville and now lives in Brooklyn with her husband. Welcome, Dawnie Walton.
Marion, thank you so much. Thank you, Kim, and everyone with the Connecticut State Library for selecting my book baby, my first novel, for this program. Libraries to me hold a very special place in my heart. They have always been sacred and cherished havens. And so it's no coincidence that my narrator, Sunny, finds her local library branch to be a place of self-discovery and empowerment and revelation. So a little bit about me. I am proudly Generation X. I was born in 1976, which is 5 years after the height of the fictional Opal and Nev and the showcase concert that launches them into headlines. And I came of age in the early 90s, a different era of rock and roll run by skater boys and riot girls. So the Opal and Nev I wrote are closer to my parents' age, not mine. And yet writing this novel unlocked a deep nostalgia for me too. Just like Sunny, discovering those Opal and Nev records at her public library, I recall feeling certain music inside my body physically, like a building scream, like a dare. That fight or flight response that Sunny describes when hearing Opal and Nev is the same feeling I had when I came home from school one day in 1991, turned on MTV, and saw Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit video for the first time. Who was that scary guy in the striped t-shirt and the shroud of blonde hair? What was that A symbol on the cheerleaders' uniforms? Why were those kids thrashing in the high school gym? And why was I so drawn to them? Was the biggest question for me. A lot of this novel for me was an exploration of what I missed about being very young and very caught up in everything having to do with music. I was thinking about my college years a lot, about Tuesdays spent at a shop in Tallahassee, Florida, where I went to school, called Vinyl Fever. By the time I came through, Vinyl Fever, of course, no longer sold vinyl, but on Tuesdays, the staff made all the new CD releases available for listening. I've thought about that and about the used section too, how my friends and I would flick through bins of those plastic jewel cases in search of gold. I thought about the agonizing choices forced by whatever little bit of money we had in our pockets, because CDs back then were like $20 a pop, which was a lot in college. And I thought about going home to pop my selected treasure into that little shelf stereo system. And I thought about how I used to clutch the lyrics books and sort of imprint the words while I was listening to the music. And then I thought back to the years before that, when I was a teenager in high school, and I would spend Friday and Saturday nights at an all ages alternative rock club in my hometown of Jacksonville. It was called Einstein A Go-Go. And there I found myself mingling inside a thrilling subculture of punks and goths, ravers, shoegazers, 24-hour party people. So yes, I loved feeling very connected to that music and those subcultures, but the older I got, the more I realized the complications I faced being part of them. For better and often for worse, music back then had a bearing on everything. Your friend groups, your personal style, your worldview. So the questions it raised for me were, what did it mean that I love genres in which I very rarely saw reflections of myself as a Black woman? What did it mean that my musical proclivities back then seemed to define me in some way, or seemed to spark other people's preconceived notions around who I was and how I chose to identify? It was actually another art form that helped me to parse some of those questions I've been asking myself. Specifically, there were two documentary films that are so influential on the birth of Opal and Nev that this novel would not probably exist had I not seen them. The first one was James Spooner's indie movie documentary, Afropunk, which I saw at a film festival in 2003, the year of its initial release. So by that time, at my big age of 27, of course, I knew that I could love weird rock and still be Black. My undergraduate experience at an HBCU, Florida A&M, had been instrumental in helping me reconcile the pieces of myself that I had once been led to believe were incongruous. And of course, I knew that it was in fact Black artists, including Big Mama Thornton, Little Richard, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and Chuck Berry, who'd invented rock and roll in the first place. And yet, watching Afropunk, sitting in that movie theater, hearing the personal stories of young brown and Black punk and hardcore fans, I found myself on the verge of tears. Never before had any art so specifically seen me. In the fans James Spooner interviewed, I recognized their love of the music, yes, and the reasons why its raucous aesthetic appealed to them, but also it was a jolt to hear what those fans shared about the loneliness of their scenes, the confusion and emotional toll of being the only Black person at the shows in their towns. These Afropunks, which was like, wow, a galvanizing name, finally. They smiled and they joked about everything, even the bits that broke their hearts. And I recognized their rueful laughter. I knew what that was, that shrugging off of the disappointing and sometimes downright offensive things that some, white people in their circles could say. Before Afropunk, I hadn't quite known that there was this movement simmering. So many underserved Black fans of rock, in fact, that not long after the documentary made its rounds on the festival circuit, a digital message board community to connect them popped up. By then, I'd felt too old to participate actively, but I certainly lurked on this alternative Black planet like a nosy big sister. And it was so much fun to watch those bonds form and that loneliness dissipate. And then one day, a few years later, I was walking through my old neighborhood in Brooklyn near the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and I stumbled upon the small stage and skate ramps that made up the inaugural Afropunk Festival. Now, today, Afropunk is very different. It's tweaked from that original vision that James Spooner had. It's pretty commercial endeavor now. It's a global brand that has festivals everywhere from Brooklyn to Paris and 1.1 million followers on Instagram. But what a revelation Afropunk was in 2005 at even a fraction of that size. Not necessarily the genesis of Opal Jewel, but the beginning of her possibility. It would be another 10 years before I'd see the documentary that fixed Opal in my mind for good. And that was 20 Feet from Stardom, directed by Morgan Neville. So that movie is about background singers, most of them Black women, who'd contributed vocals to some of the biggest pop and rock hits of our lifetimes, but had struggled to forge their own solo careers. Most folks who've seen the movie, and a lot of people I know have seen it, probably a lot of people watching have seen it, they remember the story of Mary Clayton, whom the Rolling Stones roused out of bed late one night and asked to come to a recording studio in Los Angeles. She was pregnant at the time, and Mary Clayton showed up to the studio in her house coat and her rollers, which is a really memorable story from the movie. And in her duet with Mick Jagger, she belted out the strange lyrics she was given, scary stuff about rape and murder being just a shot away. Without her voice, 1970s song Gimme Shelter would not have had the same emotion and urgency. It would not conjure the darkness and volatility of the Vietnam era. And yet before this movie came out in 2013, few people knew Mary Clayton's name or what she looked like, or that the performance she'd given was so searing, so strenuous, that some have connected it to the miscarriage she suffered soon after, or that she'd later lend her gospel-inflected vocals to the chorus of another song that surely must have held some scary darkness for her, Lynyrd Skynyrd's 1974 hit, Sweet Home Alabama. Now, Lynyrd Skynyrd is a band from my hometown, which is a whole other tangent that I can't talk about today, but people also didn't know that Mary Clayton would try a few times to put out her own albums, but she would never enjoy the breakout moment she deserved. Miss Clayton's story was the centerpiece of 20 Feet from Stardom, the climactic and perhaps most damning example of how rock and roll used Black talents but failed to properly support their careers. But even before her interview, 5 minutes into 20 Feet from Stardom, my creative synapses were going wild. In the introductory bits, Morgan Neville uses footage of background performers helping the megastars they support shine. And I recognized one of my favorite bands of all time, Talking Heads, from the concert film Stop Making Sense. There was the quirky David Byrne at center stage in his boxy gray suit, similar to the one he wore in the Once in a Lifetime video. And to his left, wearing gray short sets, micro braids, and bright red lipstick, were two stunning Black women who matched his energy note for note. They were uninhibited in their joy. Carefree Black girls, we'd hashtag these sisters now. Their names, I'd later learn, are Lynn Mabry and Edna Holt. Over the years, they have sung backing vocals for everyone from Fleetwood Mac to Brian Ferry, but I wouldn't know that until I did more digging. In the moment of discovery, I could not take my eyes off them as they sang and they danced. And though in 20 Feet from Stardom, they're only on screen for a few seconds, not even interviewed like Mary Clayton was, I felt an urge to stick my hand inside the screen and nudge one of them toward center stage with David Byrne just to see what magic might happen. So for days afterward, I could not get this image out of my head. This novel then began with a series of what if questions that incited a nostalgia-like yearning, not for what was, but for what might have been. What if a duo like that had existed in my favorite era of rock and roll, the early 1970s, not with a Black woman playing background to a white man, but on equal footing with him, sharing the same spotlight? What if they defied the constraints of genre, blew past the gatekeepers, and enjoyed a flash of fame? And what if a young Black girl in need of a heroine, someone like me, discovered one in a boundary-busting Black rock and roll queen? Pulling attributes from Black women in music I admired, I riffed on the kind of icon I would have pinned to my bedroom wall in a second back then. And I planned Opal as an amalgamation of them. Because I grew up in the age of the music video, I thought about Opal's looks and image first. I saw the cutting-edge style of Grace Jones, her reedy frame and ebony skin, the sharp angles daring you not to get too close, the cigarette dangling from her lips. I pictured Opal like Grace, scandalizing late night talk show hosts, playing versions of her wildest self in movies. But how would Opal sound? Like Tina Turner, her voice would not be pretty or sweet in any way. She would use her unique pipes to rasp, scream, grunt, hoot, roar, holler. Her stage show would be provocative and even acrobatic, like the glimpses I've seen of the woman on my t-shirt, if you can see it. This is Betty Davis, a 1970s funk queen and a songwriter and former model who'd been married to Miles Davis for one short year. But that year was long enough for her influence to nudge him out of bebop and into his electric era. Long enough, too, that when they broke up, he'd call her too wild for his taste, which is quite a thing for somebody like Miles Davis to have said. Most crucially, though, how would Opal carry herself as a Black artist in the world? Like Nina Simone, she would believe it her responsibility to reflect the times and be a fierce advocate for her community. Like Eartha Kitt, who once flipped a White House invitation from Lady Bird Johnson into an opportunity to protest the Vietnam War. She would speak truth to power despite the dire consequences it would pose to her career, despite the CIA dossiers compiled in her name. She would keep one eye on the future and always question who's watching the watcher, like the great singer-songwriter Nona Hendryx did in the 1976 LaBelle song of the same name. And speaking of LaBelle, she would galvanize as diverse a following as that trio, the first Black vocal group to make the cover of Rolling Stone. So suddenly this character in my head was growing larger than life, ballooning to superhero proportions. But the problem is I'm too much of a skeptic for all that. As important as any of the other attributes I just mentioned, I wanted Opal Jewel to feel real. That meant injecting her with flaws and vulnerabilities and crosses she must bear, and an ambition so huge it sometimes blinds her. I wanted to make her as messy as any other rock star, make her so human and fallible that I could love her through the moments she disappointed me. The world around Opal needed to be real too. I had to believe every beat of her story before I could convince you. That's why I use so much real American history as scaffolding, from the Great Migration to the tactics of J. Edgar Hoover, to even the 2016 presidential election. And in part, my desire to keep Opal rooted in the realm of reality is partly the reason I gave her Nev as a musical partner. The sad truth is, I don't believe that a Black woman like Opal, no matter how talented or how magnetic, could have broken out on her own as a rock star as early as 1971. Not if solo success never happened for Mary Clayton that year, and certainly not if the legend Tina Turner, finally free of her abusive relationship with Ike in 1976, was considered a has-been until 1983. That's the year Tina's friend, David Bowie, brought execs from Capitol Records to her Las Vegas review and essentially pushed them, despite strong opposition at the label, to give Tina the shot she'd been fighting for, a solo record deal. Imagine that, Tina Turner having trouble getting a solo record deal. The album she delivered for them, by the way, was a massive hit. Private Dancer sold 12 million copies worldwide, garnered 4 Grammys, and cemented Tina's rare place in rock and roll history. The fact that Nev and Bob Hayes, Opal and Nev's producer, are both British is also anchored in real history. Often, it was British artists who paid the most respect to the Black American blues and soul singers that, by their own admission, they'd spent their early careers emulating. The wild thing is, since this novel was published, I'm still learning about Black women who were either marginalized or totally erased from the rock scenes they helped to develop. While Opal and Nev was still in proofs, I learned of another Black woman rocker named Tina Bell, a Seattle native who fronted a pioneering grunge band called Bam Bam in the 1980s, but was cut out of the whole Seattle sound conversation that centered Pearl Jam, Nirvana, and other bands she'd clearly influenced. In the stories I devoured in my research about Tina Bell, there was even a legend about how once at a show, she'd taken on racist skinheads who called her the N-word, by swinging a microphone stand around like a lasso and clocking one of them in the head, a scene eerily similar to one I had written in Opal and Nev. I was crushed to learn that Tina Bell died of cirrhosis in 2012 at just 55 years old after her failure to launch led to a long struggle with depression and alcoholism. She was gone years before I'd even heard her name. I hear stories like that and they put an ache in my heart, especially remembering myself as a young woman in that era, the late 80s and early 90s, and hungering to experience the music and performance and image of even just a few artists like Miss Bell. And so along with the other inspirations I named, my driving hope for this novel was that it could somehow pay tribute to the Black women in rock I already knew, as well as to those I still have to discover. I hope that Opal's journey might in some way capture their resilience and spirit and their unique contributions, that this story would say to them, as the Afro-punk documentary once said to me, I see you, I celebrate you, I love you. And that's pretty much the inspiration. That's the heart of this book. And I'm so excited to hear your questions, and thank you all for listening and showing so much love to this novel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marian.
You're welcome. You know, I was listening. Well, I read the book when it first came out. I usually read the books a year ahead, and then I bring them to the book club the next year. So when I have to read it the second time, I use audio. And it was an ensemble cast in the audio. It was amazing. It was like Virgil LaFleur. He was just my friend, okay? He's, you know, if he was out now, he would be the biggest star. He would be the dresser of all the stars, right? The book is so deep on so many levels. Sonny Shelton or Saralina Curtis, the fact that she has two identities is deep enough, right? But a lot of the book is from her perspective, but yet there were things that she could not see. Like she couldn't see Opal's time in France. She couldn't see Nev's time in England. I guess she could have read about it. You want to talk more about that, how her point of view was developed?
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for that question. So Sonny, funny enough, is a character that did not come into the story until I'd written about 2/3 of a full draft. The book initially was just the straight oral histories. The editor that was putting it together was invisible, not part of the story whatsoever. And when I went to graduate school at the University of Iowa and started workshopping the novel, you know, my classmates said, you know, we love this. We think this is really fun, but our question for you is, who is everybody talking to? Because the book is so much about performance. And so there's this idea that as people are telling their stories, they're doing a bit of performance themselves. And so who is that audience? And that really made me think that, oh, here's an opportunity to create a character and sort of inject her into the story in a really interesting way. And this is not a spoiler to say, because it's the first paragraph of the book. But Sonny has a very personal and painful connection to the birth of Opal and Nev, which is that her father was their drummer, and he's killed during Rivington Showcase, which is sort of the concert that launches Opal and Nev into notoriety. And so, you know, writing, once I thought, okay, am I really going to do this? Because it was a major change for the book, you know, then I had to sort of think of Sonny being on the other side of the recorder. And it required me to go all the way back to the beginning and write that opening editor's note and everything. But it also, the creation of Sonny helped to instantly kind of bring in a present storyline, because suddenly you can picture not only the characters in the past as they're telling their stories, but in the present, and think about what they might have at stake. And it sort of allowed me to close or close the loop is a wrong phrase, but sort of make connections, I guess, between the present and the past. And personally, you know, I worked as a journalist for many years in entertainment journalism at magazines. And so it was a little bit fun for me as a writer to kind of tap into that part of my experience. And a lot of the Sunny material is kind of personal for me. You know, it's I didn't realize how close it was until, you know, I was writing the book and drafting, and my husband was reading it as I was doing it. And he was like, okay, wait a minute, your name is Dawnie and her name is Sunny. Like, yes, that's very close. And I hadn't even realized that I had done that. So yeah, this, you know, Sunny kind of, I think, changed the whole vibe of the book and really kind of, I think, made it a lot more layered and interesting. And also, honestly, that present storyline, as I was writing it, the presidential election was unfolding. And it was also a way for me to kind of process it. I was deep into the drafts on election night in 2016. And I remember calling my mother very upset, and her kind of reminding me, you know, that there have been dark times, you know, before. And so like kind of, it just was kind of all coming together in a really magical, interesting, provocative way.
I see a question from Marguerite. It says, it was important that Nev was three-dimensional too. He had to have mixed motives. Can you speak to Nev's character and motivations?
Thank you so much, Marguerite, for that question. Yeah. It's been so interesting to hear different people's reactions to Nev. You know, I get a lot of people that say, oh, I can't stand him, I hate Nev. The fact is that like Nev makes terrible mistakes, and without spoiling anything too much for people who are still reading it, I will say his biggest flaw, which is also Opal's biggest flaw as well, is ambition. They are both hugely ambitious, except the difference is Opal's a Black woman, Nev is a white man. And so Opal and her ambition has a lot more at stake. And Opal feels when she is in the spotlight that she is carrying her community with her because of the person that she is. And so there are bridges that she will not cross. There are things that she will not do. And Nev's ambition is such that he will do almost anything. That's how much he wants it. And so in that sense, I often felt sad for Nev. And I do think as a character, I think like I always felt like I wanted him to be hugely talented with a lot of promise, but also just kind of lost. And in a sense, not having the same kind of community that Opal has kind of leads him to some dark places and to some very selfish, self-interested places. I was also thinking about Nev as a chameleonic figure. You know, when we talk about a lot of white male rock stars, we think about like the chameleon figure and how we see they're allowed to kind of have different phases of their careers and change their sound and their image. And I thought, you know, well, what does that mean? Like, how changeable does that make a person's spirit or their soul? And so that was kind of like where I was coming from with the Nev character. Yeah.
So I see Kim is back on. Does that mean we're out of time?
Yeah, we are, which is breaking my whole entire heart. Dawnie, I feel like the millennial version of you, where sort of your music interests in particular tell a message about you, which might be part of the message that you want to share with the people around you, but not the only message. Oh my gosh, I resonated. I'm downloading the audiobook. We have it on Palace. Let me get it first. Because I'm a big audiobook fan, and Marion just raving about that did it. That was all I needed to hear.
Oh, I hope you enjoy it.
Oh, I will. Oh, I will. You don't know this, but I know that you actually wrote this book for me. You too, but like I think that's how I feel.
That was the goal. That was the goal.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dawnie, for being here and giving us some of your time. Congratulations on the final revival of Opal and Nev. Miriam, thank you so much for being such a fantastic host and question asker. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our second annual All CT Reads author launch. Give us about 7-ish days to get the recordings processed and chopped up, and they will be available on the website. Share Dawnie's talk and everyone else's with your book clubs, with your library patrons. Just watch it again, because I'm probably going to, and also 20 Feet from Stardom. What a movie. Thank you again to Dawn and Deborah, our fearless leaders who put so much support behind this initiative. And we'll talk to you all soon.